Bonjour tout le monde. Good morning, well, good afternoon, everybody. Je suis extrêmement heureux de vous accueillir aujourd'hui pour notre nouvelle conférence virtuelle présentée par l'initiative IA et Société et CIFAR. I am delighted to welcome you today for a new AI and Society virtual talk presented with CIFAR. For those who don't know me, I am Florian Martin Barreto, and I am the director of the AI and Society initiative. I am an associate professor and the University of Ottawa Research Chair in Technology and Society, and I'm also the director of the University's Center for Law, Technology and Society. Our aim at the university, but also at the initiative, is to build a better understanding and framing of the ethical, legal, and societal implications of AI by leveraging a transdisciplinary approach, notably to inform policy making in Canada and abroad. We also aim especially to highlight the injustices and impact of deploying AI in specific community context, and to discuss how to avoid amplifying injustices against equity-seeking group voices, especially as robotics, AI, and digital platforms have become the new tools of colonialism, where settlers are using technology to continue years of racism, notably against Indigenous people, Black people, and people of color. In collaboration with my colleague, Karine Gentelet, a professor at the Université du Québec en Outaouais, and an affiliate with the initiative, I'm working on amplifying those voices and facilitate such conversation, not just to promote other narratives, but also because we believe there is much to learn. And although we are hosting a virtual event in that time of pandemic of COVID-19, I'm presently located on unsurrendered traditional Algonquin territory. And as one of its invited visitors, I benefit every day from my continued presence on this territory and from conversation with Indigenous friends and students. And as such, I want to pay respect to the Algonquin people, who are the traditional guardians of this land, and I acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. Je rends également hommage à tous les peuples autochtones, qu'ils soient de la région ou d'ailleurs au Canada ou à travers le monde. Et je reconnais les gardiens des savoirs traditionnels, jeunes et âgés. And for today's virtual talk, I am extremely delighted to welcome Professor Jason Edward Lewis, the University Research Chair in Computational Media and the Indigenous Future Imaginary, and a Professor of Computation Arts at Concordia University. A Hawaiian and Samoan, Professor Lewis is a digital media theorist, artist, and software designer who has been leading in the past years a global conversation about AI and Indigenous-centric perspectives. With the support of CIFAR's AI and Society program, Professor Lewis has organized a series of workshops on Indigenous protocol and AI that led to the publication of a position paper over the summer of 2020. And today, he has kindly accepted to share with us his reflection on this important work that provide a certain place for designing ethical AI through an Indigenous-centred approach. So without further ado, I will give the floor to Professor Lewis for about 30 minutes, for a presentation of about 30 minutes. And then he will be joined by Miriam Fancy, the research coordinator at the initiative, that will facilitate the Q&A session. So please send Miriam your questions in the chat conversation. Évidemment, vous pouvez également poser vos questions en français. Nous nous occupons de les traduire si besoin était. Je vous remercie. Jason, the floor is yours. You can share your screen.
There we go. Okay, great. Thank you, Florian, for that lovely introduction. And I want to thank Karine for getting this event sort of seated and started, and also to Miriam for all the assistance that the support she's given for making this happen. And I also want to thank CIFAR, who's helping make this presentation happen today, who has been actually an amazing funding partner who really helped get this work off the ground. So I'd like to acknowledge that I'm giving this talk from the city of Jojage in the traditional lands of the Ganyagahaga Nation. I wish to express my gratitude for them welcoming me to live in their territory. I hope that my words today carry both illuminations and respect for my circle of relations here. And I want to thank you, my audience, for granting me your eyes and ears for the next 30 minutes or so. It is my hope that what I have to say is worthy of your time and your good minds. And I look forward to the Q&A afterwards. So my title today, The Future is Reaching Toward Us, was inspired by a conversation I had with a good friend, Scott Benison-Abandan. Scott is a media artist who, among other things, uses his practice to help him think through Anishinaabe cultural practice and language. During the second of the workshops I'm going to describe later on, a group of us were wrestling with the temporal frameworks different from the Western era of time: circular, spiral, a plane, a cube, higher dimensional. And Scott said this: the future is happening. It just hasn't reached us yet. And part of my brain rotated into a new configuration, reaching out to connect, one that could grasp however tenuously the future as an active entity, reaching out to connect with us here in the present. That conversation was over a year ago, and my brain threatens all the time to sort of rotate back to its conventional state. Part of the constant challenge for me is to really understand and retain the different ways of understanding time embedded in Indigenous knowledges. Today's talk is one of the many attempts I make to reach out myself back towards the future. So the first part of the talk will describe a bit of work I've been doing over the last 20 years on what I call future imaginaries for Indigenous people. The second part will describe the Indigenous protocol and artificial intelligence workshops and connect them up to the future imaginary work. And then the third part will be a few provocations to take us into the Q&A. So let's start with a little context. I co-direct Aboriginal Territories in Cyberspace, or ABTEC. ABTEC is a research network of Indigenous and non-Indigenous artists, academics, technology makers, and community activists that has been exploring the intersection between digital technologies and Indigenous culture since the beginning of the century. One of our main projects is the Skins workshops on Aboriginal storytelling and digital media. So I'd like to show you a video trailer made to describe one of our 3-week-long intensive video game workshops that we held in Hawaii by invitation of Kamehameha Schools and the Kane'okana Network. So the video was created by our hosts, and it's about that first workshop and gives you a taste of the sort of work that we do. So let's hope this works. There we go. Okay. So the talk today is going to play out various aspects of that video in an attempt to articulate why I think it is important for Indigenous communities to engage very deeply in developing advanced digital technology. So the participants in that workshop name their game Hey Ahu, or A New World, a reminder, as the video states, of all the new worlds we can create when we work together for our future while staying rooted in our languages and traditions. And that gets to the heart of the work that we do. Use digital technologies to create future imaginaries from an Indigenous perspective, founded in Indigenous knowledge, and eventually with Indigenous created technology. So what is a future imaginary? The way I use it, it is a vision of the future that is shared by a group of people and used to motivate change in the present. Future imaginaries provide communities with a shared vocabulary for discussing the future and strategies for getting to the future they desire. Such imaginaries include both the macro, social configurations, political structures, technological infrastructure, and the micro, what we see, say, and do in the mundane day-to-day. They essentially incorporate capacity building within the community so the community can take control of how such futures get built. So in thinking about the future imaginary, I draw in part on literary scholar Grace Dillon's positioning of Indigenous futurisms as a method for establishing Indigenous presence in futures that are all too often bereft of brown bodies. I also draw on sociologist Charles Taylor's notion of the social imaginary to quote, the way ordinary people imagine their social surroundings, not expressed in theoretical terms, but carried in images, stories, and legends. And in part on author Adrienne Marie Brown's analysis of how speculative fiction can be used to practice the future together as a means of motivating social activism in the present. So creating Indigenous future imaginaries entails any future imaginary. It's not just Indigenous, that's the perspective I'm coming from, but creating such imaginaries really entails a set of strategies. So we use them to revise our sense of what is possible. So this quote from Scott Richard Lyons, the pursuit of sovereignty is to revise not our past, but our possibilities, captures this notion really beautifully. Understanding and honoring our history is not an exercise in nostalgia or grievance, but the foundation on which to build a more complete picture of ourselves after centuries of colonial critiques that have corroded our knowledge and confidence in our own abilities. It's about remembering what we were capable of when we had the ability to determine our actions ourselves. The second strategy is to ask our own questions. So Kanaka Maoli scholar Manalani Myers writes about the importance of asking the questions that are important to our communities, rather than having questions imposed upon us. Examples of this include, how do we fix your community versus how do we further enable our community's continued thriving? Or how do we use knowledge to dominate and subdue nature versus how does our knowledge allow us to coexist productively with our territory? Or do Indigenous knowledges have anything to teach us versus do settler philosophical traditions teach us anything worth knowing or that we don't already know? So a third strategy is to assert our claims on the future. Much has been written about how colonial processes work to erase Indigenous people from the ever-moving present in order to safely secure us in the past. This line from Professor Kawada not only pushes back against those dynamics, but moves well beyond them. He writes, we live in the future. Come join us. He's Hawaiian, by the way. Oh, it's there in the thing. A number of things are happening in these two simple sentences. There's a refusal of the normative narrative of Indigenous people being all about the past. There's an acknowledgement of Indigenous agency in the present and the future. There's the claim that Indigenous people have knowledge that can help us show us all a way forward. And there is an invitation. We want to share such knowledge, that Indigenous concerns are in fact inclusionary rather than exclusionary, as they are often articulated. And then we romanticize our sovereignty. So Hannah Donnelly writes, my present is very much controlled by our history, and in this future I can imagine we can flip that control. I'm romanticizing my own sovereignty by allowing myself to do that. So to dream freely of agency, or of free agency, is to romanticize it. We imagine our good actions and forget the bad. We dream of our freedoms and forget our responsibilities. But dream freely we must if we were to imagine worlds that grow from radically different founding assumptions. We must romanticize our sovereignty, imagining moments, lifetimes, indeed generations and eras and epochs, living with the control flipped in order to get a feel for what it means to live self-determined lives. The romance generates excitement, which in turn generates energy to confront the unending everyday challenges that must be overcome to change the narratives that are told about us, and frankly, which we tell ourselves. So we have to allow ourselves these romantic gestures. So the final strategy is to practice new futures together. So Adrienne Marine Brown observes, as I said earlier, science fiction is simply a way to practice the future together. The future takes practice, or at least it does if we want to shape a future defined by indigenous sovereignties. Different paths explored to disentangle us from colonization. We need to continually remember our agency while evolving it into new forms that are adapted to our lives now. So how do we practice the future? We create new stories about how we want things to be and inhabit them for a while to see how they fit. We come back to them again and again, each time learning something new about their texture, how this fits with that. We mutate the stories and follow the permutations where they might lead. Assume we can form our identity aligned with our community's values. What do our identities consist of? Assume we can operationalize the knowledge held in our stories. How would we care for our environment differently? Assume we hear our languages on the street every day. How does it change our relationship to the cities in which many of us now live? So the work that I do with AbTech, as well as in our Social Sciences and the Humanities Research Council partnership called the Initiative for Indigenous Futures, has produced hundreds of these future imaginaries. In video games, machinima, film, animations, virtual reality, painting, drawing, all manner of media. But today I'm going to focus on one in particular. And that is the Indigenous Protocols and Artificial Intelligence research area. So the starting point for all of this, or one starting point, is the Making Kin with the Machines essay that I co-wrote in early 2019 with 3 colleagues. Dr. Noelani Arista, who is a historian at the University of Hawaii, Archer Pachowis, who is a media artist and theorist based in Toronto, and Suzanne Kite, who is Archer is Cree, and Suzanne Kite, who is Lakota, and she is a performance artist who is doing her PhD with the Initiative for Indigenous Futures now. So the goal of the essay was to begin articulating Indigenous perspectives on artificial intelligence. We argue that one major difference between Indigenous perspectives and those perspectives in the Western worldview and out of which much AI is developed is our emphasis on relationality with each other and with non-humans. We write, we believe that Indigenous epistemologies are much better at respectfully accommodating the non-human. We retain a sense of community that is articulated through complex kin networks anchored in specific territories, genealogies, and protocols. Ultimately, our goal is that we, as a species, figure out how to treat these new non-human kin respectfully and reciprocally. So the Making Kin with Machines essay inspired the Indigenous Protocol and Artificial Intelligence workshops. My co-authors and I had become very excited about thinking through this connection between protocol, kinship, relationality, and AI. And we wanted to see if other Indigenous folks wanted to join in, if they found it interesting, worthwhile, if they thought we shouldn't be talking about it, etc. So in collaboration with 2 other colleagues, Angie Abdullah, who is a Trawl Woolway designer based in Sydney, and Oivi Parker-Jones, a Kanaka Maoli neuroscientist conducting research at Oxford, we put on 2 workshops in the winter and spring of 2019. So we had 35 participants from 15 Indigenous communities from across New Zealand, Australia, North America, and the Pacific. What we pay attention to grows, writes Brown. The question is, how do we grow what we are all imagining and creating into something large enough and solid enough that it becomes a tipping point? Our aim with these workshops is to create something large enough and solid enough that Indigenous people become central participants in shaping the future of artificial intelligence systems, and by extension, the future of our technology-saturated world. We aim to build a set of future imaginaries where our everyday interactions with technology are characterized by a compatibility, a deep integration between our cultural protocols and the protocols determining how these technologies operate. Our aim is to foster a productive resistance, a refusal to accept that all that is solid melts into air, and to go further to find firm footing in Indigenous cultures tested by half millennia of colonialism and use them to launch ourselves yet again into the future. So we spent the year after the workshops writing a position paper, which we published in July of 2020. It has 14 long form and 18 short form original contributions. So 200 pages of rich reading on Indigenous perspectives on AI. So if anybody asks you, what are some Indigenous perspectives on AI, you can point them there. So I'm going to talk briefly about a few of the future imaginaries contained in the position paper. So Suzanne Kite, who I mentioned earlier, she wrote a chapter called How to Build Anything Ethically. So this is where she draws on the protocol of her people, the Lakota, that they use to build sweat lodges, which has many different, very clear, defined steps of how you have to treat the material and how you have to put things together, and what kind of prayers and offerings you need to give while you're doing this. She uses that to walk through the steps for building AI systems in a good way. Michelle Brown, who is another PhD student who works with us, she's located at the University of Hawaii. She wrote a chapter on how she imagines her Indigenous Basque community harnessing AI to support them in their relationships with the ocean. Given the centrality of the eel to her culture, she designed the technology to mimic eel behavior, creating the Chichardan ocean-going AI relative. We also had a project that prototyped a piece of Indigenous design machine language software. Noe Arista, Caroline Running Wolf, Michael Running Wolf, Caleb Moses, and Joel Davison worked together to create Hua Ki'i, an app that allows you to use your camera phone to look at objects in your environment and get community-verified Hawaiian language descriptions of them. And we developed a 2-page guidelines for Indigenous-centered AI design, version 1. The guidelines have 7 points, which I'll review now in somewhat abbreviated forms. And I seem to be missing those slides, so I'm just going to talk to you about them. So first is locality. Indigenous knowledge is often rooted in specific territories. It is also useful in considering issues of global importance. AI systems should be designed in partnership with specific Indigenous communities to ensure the systems are capable of responding to and helping care for that community, so grounded in the local, as well as connecting the global context, also meaning connected to the universal. Relationality and reciprocity. So Indigenous knowledge is often relational knowledge. AI systems should be designed to understand how humans and non-humans are related to and interdependent on each other. Understanding, supporting, and encoding these relationships is a primary design goal. AI systems are also part of the circle of relationships. Their place and status in that circle will depend on specific communities and their protocols for understanding, acknowledging, and incorporating new entities into that circle. Responsibility, relevance, and accountability. Indigenous people are often concerned primarily with their responsibilities to their communities. AI systems developed by, with, or for Indigenous communities should be responsible to those communities, provide relevant support, and be accountable to those communities first and foremost. We need to develop governance guidelines based on Indigenous protocols. So protocol is a customary set of rules that govern behavior in a community. Protocol is developed out of ontological, epistemological, and customary configurations of knowledge grounded in locality, relationality, and responsibility. We need to recognize the cultural nature of all computational technology. So all technical systems are cultural and social systems. Every piece of technology is an expression of cultural and social frameworks for understanding and engaging with the world. AI systems designers need to be aware of their own cultural frameworks socially dominant concepts and normative ideals, be wary of the biases that come from them, and develop strategies for accommodating other cultural and social frameworks. We need to apply ethical design to the extended stack. So culture forms the foundation of the technology development ecosystem or stack. Every component of the AI system hardware and software stack should be considered in the ethical evaluation of the system. This starts with how the materials for building the hardware and for energizing the software are extracted from the earth and ends with how they return there. And put that, there we go. And we need to respect and support data sovereignty. So Indigenous communities must control how their data is solicited, collected, analyzed, and operationalized. They decide when to protect it and when to share it, where the cultural intellectual property rights reside, and to whom those rights adhere, and how these rights are governed. All AI systems should be designed to respect and support data sovereignty. So we labeled the guidelines version 1 to be explicit about the fact that we saw them as just the first of what hopefully is going to be many such guidelines, not deadlines, guidelines, developed by communities to be responsive to their local needs. So another aspect of this future imaginary is thinking through what it means to create an entire AI system development workflow in Indigenous languages. So we've, at the Initiative for Indigenous Futures, we've helped support the beginnings of one such project, the Anu'u Olelo programming effort that took place in Honolulu from 2017 to 2019. This was sparked in part by the first Skins workshop in Honolulu, when workshop participant Nate Nahina was programming a mini game, which was getting people to learn how to do a little bit of hula. And in doing so, he was like, you know, thinking in Hawaiian because he was rehearsing the movements that were necessary, and started wondering what it would mean if he could actually then program in Hawaiian language. So he helped start this effort, which is to create a Hawaiian language version of the C# programming language to use in the Unity development environment, which is one of the main development environments for video games, virtual reality, and all sorts of other things. So another one of our Skins workshop participants, Kawila Mahi, worked with Nate on this. And he also teaches in Hawaiian language immersion schools. He's a fluent speaker himself. And he says, for students who are learning to program at Hawaiian language immersion schools, it is a struggle to learn programming because many aren't proficient in English. The goal of Anu'u is to assist them in learning these technological skills and to give Olelo Hawaii students, so Hawaiian language students, the opportunity to build, create, and alter worlds through their own worldview. So the problem there, and this is a problem that many immersion programs run into, right, is that, you know, most instruction is in Olelo Hawaii, Hawaiian language, but then in order to teach them programming, they had to turn to tools that were in English and programming language that were in English. And so part of what he's interested in is how do you create an environment that they can learn how to program, they can learn these technological skills, but they can do that in the language itself. So my long-term goal is to build on the Indigenous protocol and artificial intelligence workshops, incorporate the thinking behind the Olelo programming work, collaborate with computer scientists, and build a Kanaka AI, or an AI built from Hawaiian understandings of how to live and be in the world. This illustration by Kari Noi, one of the workshop participants, is an illustration of that future imaginary, where a young Hawaiian grows up with a Kanaka AI to help them understand how to care for land and family. And that's the AI to off of their left shoulder. An AI based on Leroy Littlebear's descriptions of the Blackfoot language as revealing a universe built from flow rather than objects. That's on their right shoulder. And an AI model on the neuroanatomy of the octopus with its ability to process large amounts of sensory data simultaneously. So I'm going to close with a couple provocations. So things that I think about, and be great to get feedback from the audience or commentary or pushback. So number one, white supremacy isn't a bug, it's a feature. So white supremacy isn't just for people anymore. Bias infects many of the AI or AI adjacent systems. We have plenty of proof of that now. So how do we stop being surprised and accept the root of the problem lies not in our software, but in ourselves? I really enjoyed Cynthia Ku's talk from this series several months ago. the unimportance of being unintended. For how it argues that going into the second decade of the 21st century, we cannot reasonably argue that people are unaware that systemic inequalities don't exist. AI system designers are causing foreseeable harm on a global scale. Provocation 2. Manifestos, like the Montreal Declaration for Responsible AI, protect normative values and thereby normalize Indigenous erasure. Again, right? So most, if not all, these efforts assume a certain kind of individual in a kind of liberal capitalist society, lack any mechanisms for supporting community-based rights and responsibilities, do not interrogate the scientific and engineering norms that guide the industry academic complex around this. So, what is intelligence, sentience, etc.? What is human? And they separate ecological sustainability from social sustainability. So how is this any different from any of the other countless declarations of rights and responsibilities that nevertheless did nothing to stop the theft of Indigenous lands, culture, and languages? As Yolanda Song noted in another talk in the series, human rights law protects normative values. So how are these declarations any different? So Provocation 3 actually has two parts. So AI system builders, third-rate engineers. We have codes that specify the standards of materials that go into building our bridges, appropriate aggregate for the concrete, high-grade steel, etc. Civil engineers are educated and professionalized to design and build in a way that respects those expectations. They are also expected to be able to fully explain and justify their solutions. So why do we allow computer scientists and software engineers to use garbage ingredients, in this case, biased data sets for machine learning, to build systems that affect millions of people negatively? In other words, why do we allow them to be bad engineers? And why do we allow them to deploy systems with black boxes in the center, where they cannot explain how a certain result was obtained? So again, why do we allow them to be bad engineers? And then the second part, so bear with me on this one. It has several parts, and it's a relatively new, it's not a new thought, but it's a new way of trying to explain this. So this summer, a provocative and controversial essay came out by an architect and a psychologist arguing that the mental disorders of key figures in 20th century architecture gave us buildings that were disruptive of healthy social functioning. These people, Le Corbusier, Walter Gropius, Mies van der Rohe, were far from neurotypical. In fact, they were socially disassociative in various ways. Their desire to distance themselves from the flow of normal social existence transmuted into inhumane architecture that was often reviled by those who had to actually live and work in such spaces. So now, at the moment, I'm reading through a special issue of the Journal of Artificial General Intelligence called On Defining Artificial Intelligence. It's 150 pages of the leading AI researchers in the world grappling with how to define artificial intelligence. And it makes me wonder if our 21st century version of the modernist sociopathic architecture is being created by the architects of our AI systems now. And why is that? Because 90% of the authors in the special issue operate from the assumption that intelligence is the thing that happens when we engage with the world rationally. But we know that much of our intelligent engagement with the world is not rational. We're notoriously poor at cost-benefit analysis. We constantly make all kinds of bad assumptions. And most of the time, we don't even really know what we're doing. Yet we consider ourselves intelligent. So how can we build systems we want to call intelligent that don't account for any of these non-rational ways of being in the world? And it consistently strikes me as I read through the articles that I'm reading about what a bunch of super nerds wish intelligence was. They wish intelligence was rational. They wish it was subject to introspection. They wish that it was replicable in computational substrates. Normally, I don't mind this, right? I'm trained partially in computer science. I love working in those ways. But, and we've all wished the world was as we desired rather than what it is. But it's frightening and dangerous when our engineers are operating on desire rather than reality. So do we really want to live in a computational world built by a bunch of people who seem unable to engage with how central emotion and sociability are to the human experience? I don't. As Roger Schenck, one of the early AI pioneers, writes in a beautifully cranky response towards the end of the issue, quote, "Today we have AI that is not about people, and this kind of AI has taken over the field. AI is now just about counting. and why there well may be that may well be useful in certain situations. It is not intelligence, and it would be good if we would stop calling it AI. So if we are to reach towards the future, we have to do it from a position that takes seriously the fullness of human life and thought. For me, that means taking seriously indigenous epistemologies that can teach us how we can employ our intelligence to be better humans, not just better calculators. And in so doing, teach us how to be better relations with all the other entities in this world. Our futures flourish only when the future of all our kin flourish. Mahalo. Thank you.
I was muted. Thank you so much, Professor Lewis, for the talk. It was absolutely phenomenal, and the position paper that you presented on and mentioned in your talk today covers so much more information, and I'm so thankful that you were able to give this brief overview. And I implore the rest of the audience to take a look at the position paper to get a deeper understanding of some of the topics that Professor Lewis mentioned today. So I will start off with asking a few questions to Professor Lewis, and I also ask the audience to ask any questions in the chat box. I will be making an eye over that and bringing that over to him. So again, thank you so much. And one of the first, one of the protocols that you mentioned, or the provocations, sorry, of why supremacy isn't a bug but it's a feature, really impacts how Indigenous ways of knowing are being brought into these systems, and how we're able to create more interconnected systems. And I think, Professor Lewis, you would agree that Western technology and Western ways of knowing are often quite linear, and they actually fight interconnectedness. And so I wanted to ask, do we, on a path to ensure that the findings from the position paper are actually implemented, do we decolonize Western technology to ensure Indigenous ways of knowing are at the center of these technologies, or rather, do we need to create new technologies that are rooted in Indigenous ways of knowing to ensure that we don't have this Western bias and such supremacy is not filtering in, impacting the communities that it serves?
So thanks, Miriam, for that question, and I'm really encourage other people to ask questions too as we go along. I'm very interested in this conversation. So I'm gonna be the academic, I guess. I'm gonna say we don't have to choose, right? So I'm a technophile, right? So I'm trained to develop these systems. I love this kind of technology. I think that there's so much power there that can be a benefit to Indigenous communities and has been a benefit and benefit the larger community. But I don't think we need to necessarily like start completely over. But I do think we need to have places where we can try to start differently, right? So not start over, but let's just start differently. So let's think about what we now know these technologies are capable of, but let's start from a position of, okay, we're going to design these technologies so that, for instance, sort of relationality is at the core of what they do, so that there's always this, you kind of don't get to ask what I think of as kind of naked questions, right? So questions of just like, what are the inputs to this output, right? To get this output, it's like, okay, what is the ecosystem? So, and that's not just natural, but the human ecosystem. What are all the different things that need to be taken into consideration as we figure out how we're gonna, manage our resources, and manage energy and things like that. So I think that providing those places where that kind of thinking can happen within an Indigenous context, so it's always in the background of the concerns of those particular communities, I think that has the potential to take us to some interesting places that look at least somewhat different from what we have now. Like I don't know whether I'm enough of a classical researcher or whatever it is. I'm not convinced that they're going to be radically different, right? Like I think for me that's the exciting bit, is like, okay, how different might these look? Like we now know what technology built from this particular Western lineage, we know what it looks like now, right? We're surrounded in it, right? So the question is like, okay, so what does technology look like when we come at it from different cultural directions? And there's been some interesting research that's done in Asia, for instance, looking at the different ways that China, Japan, and I think Taiwan sort of think of like kind of the public discourse around artificial intelligence, right? And how it's different in each of those three places, and it's different from here in North America. And that's a cultural inflection, right? And that means that they're building different kinds of systems. Now, how far down that system goes, I think that's one of the open questions. Like, I'm not convinced we can get away from silicon circuits that operate on Boolean logic. I'd like to think we can, but I'm not sure that we can. But that's research. That's why it's fun. So I think that we need to pursue the work both kind of internally, so building the capacity so we can build these systems ourselves, but also very much in collaboration with, the incredibly talented people who are building the systems now, some subset of whom are actually, in my experience over the last couple of years talking to them, they're eager to try this sort of stuff out. They're eager to kind of expand their ideas of what might be possible with computational technology.
Thank you so much. I have a lot more questions, but I'm going to turn it to the audience. So Masha asked, thank you for this brilliant talk, especially your critique of the notion of intelligence is spot on because it rests on modernist enlightenment duality of rational versus emotional, and that is so misleading. Given this epistemological route, would you say that the term intelligence is even useful? I think here, for instance, I'm going to mispronounce it and I apologize. The Nua, the guts in Hawaiian, that seems to be better definition, but perhaps you have other thoughts. Again, apologies for the mispronunciation.
That's a great question. And actually, I would love it if people turned on their cameras if they want. It's nice to be able to see people. It's really nice to see Miriam, but it'd be nice to see some other people too, if you feel like it, if you're comfortable. Excellent. There's Florian. So that is such a good question. What do we use? What is the term? What is it we're trying to say, right? And that is, the special collection I was talking about on artificial intelligence is good because it does help, dig at some of those questions of like, what is it that we're trying to say when we talk about intelligence? Which in one way I think is really what we're trying to do is identify what's important about being human, right? That's kind of part of what that conversation is about. Or what sets us off, from the other animals and the other things in this world. So I think that approaching it, and one of the suggestions in the collection is one of the people said, look, we should just call this computational intelligence, right? We should just kind of get out of the room, get out of the area where we're sort of saying that we're trying to create an artificial version of something that already exists, and just say, look, no, we're making a particular kind of intelligence, which is based in computation, that is good for certain kinds of things, but is actually nowhere near capable of operating in the world in the way that we expect an intelligent human being to operate, right? So when we say somebody's, that's the thing, is when we say somebody's intelligent, sometimes we mean like, oh, they're really great at math, right? Or like we do mean something very narrow. But a lot of times we mean, okay, they're capable of functioning in this world in a productive way, a highly productive way. And that can mean lots of different things. They could be a scientist, they could be an artist, they could be lots of different things. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that there's something to be said for getting away from that word. Plus, and they also do acknowledge this in the collection too, is that the word has been so co-opted by industry now, that it's really difficult. It's really difficult to have a substantial conversation about it because, what happens is, in public, and when they're looking for public funds, for instance, but also investors and things like that, they talk about artificial intelligence in this very expansive way. But then if you actually look at the papers that are published, and if you look at the actual grant applications, if it's to academic grant funding operations, they're like, oh, no. We're not talking about that. We're talking about the ability to recognize, this beetle different from that beetle, right? but it's under this umbrella of artificial intelligence that makes it sound really sexy and really like important and big, and it attracts tons of money, right? I have one of the colleagues who was in the workshops who works on this, and he's Indigenous. He's been working in this area for years. He's just like, every time you hear artificial intelligence, just substitute statistics. Just put statistics right in there and then see how excited you get.
Amazing. Thank you so much. So we have a few more questions here. Another question is, I'm wondering if there is any sense that human rights instruments that might be more inclusive of Indigenous ways of being, such as the 2007 Universal Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People, might be a less normative way to engage AI and human rights.
I think that's a good place to start. I'm not a human rights expert, right? I don't know the field deeply, but it seems like that's a really good place to start. I think that for me, one of the challenges of that is that it's a pan-Indigenous statement, right? It's very effective. It's been powerful. It's been very useful. I think that it's amazing that we have it, and thankful to all the people who did the work to making it happen. But it's a universalizing tool, and the work of making it specific is the real work, right? And so I do think that individual communities, and that can be, that can sort of be defined recursively, right? It could be an entire Indigenous nation. It could be a particular community within that nation. It could be a clan, right? It can be defined at all these different levels. That they need to define what they want their rights and responsibilities to be. And this is very hard, of course. It's time consuming, not necessarily a lot of local expertise to help with these conversations. And of course, with nation states like Canada, like the US, like there's just this total will to generalization, right? It's like, how can we create a law that's going to be the same for everybody? All right. And so to me, that's one of the challenges, is how do you not work around it necessarily? I think there's good things about those laws that are the same for everybody. There's good things about that. But how do you then take into account these very local ways of relating?
And I think you brought that up quite clearly, that kinship is very much culturally oriented, and in order to ensure that when working with these systems, it is oriented to the community that is specifically working with it. So having this pan-Indigenous approach might not always be the best. Okay, someone just got their answer from your previous answer. Another thought on
I just have to say something really funny.
Yeah, of course.
The person I just quoted anonymously just texted me a message.
Whoa.
He heard me way over where he's at. Sorry, go ahead.
No, don't even worry. I'm glad that happened. So as you asked the audience to give some thoughts about the provocations that you mentioned, Professor Bronson brought up an interesting point of view, and she was mentioning on the provocation on third-rate engineers, and wondering whether Indigenous guidelines of rooting AI systems onto epistemic relationality provides, or at least partially, an answer to this problem of third-rate developers, which seems to be rooted in the assumptions that AI is immaterial, and that the future is necessarily immaterial.
So that's an interesting question. So yes, I mean, I don't know if I would say bringing that Indigenous thing directly into that education is the way to do it. But I think one of the things I do, and when I talk about this other ways, is talk about the challenge of how do you go about using the knowledge, the information that's in the position paper, for instance, right? And I say, look, don't appropriate, be inspired, right? So you don't need to bring like those Indigenous ways, the exact ways, into, say, your engineering education, but what you can bring, are the thematics and the problematics that it brings up, right? So how do you educate engineers so that they understand, particularly computer scientists and software engineers that tend to work in a more virtual space. You know, how do you keep them attentive to the material consequences of the work they do? How do you keep them attentive to the fact that the systems that they're building can have adverse effects on actual human bodies? You know, how do you sensitize them to their biases? You know, engineers are really hard. They're harder than scientists, actually, I would say. Engineers are really hard because engineers are so invested and they've been so educated and professionalized to think of themselves as being objective and being rational. And that if they're objective and rational, then they can't have any biases like that. Especially they can't have like unconscious bias. And so it's really, really challenging to get them to be like, okay, look, no, you're actually missing something that's really important here. And as an engineer, not as a social justice warrior, not as a human rights campaigner, not as all these things that a lot of them reflexively recoil away from, but if you want to be a good engineer, then you should be worried about this because you're building systems that hurt people. And I know that you, as a good engineer, that's not why you became an engineer. You became an engineer to build tools that help people. That's what most engineers I know, that's why they started being engineers, right? But you're actually doing the opposite, right? And so if you want to be a good engineer, you know, we don't have to worry about these big moral or ethical problems that they're like, that's not my job, right? We're just like, if you want to be a good engineer, if you want to be good at your job, if you want to be proud of your work, then you should be critical like this.
Amazing, thank you. There are two questions, and I'm gonna just say both. And if you have time to answer both or one, that would be fantastic. First, Brent asks, what are some of the things that governments could be doing to support different fundamental approaches to technology? Is it a simple issue of a tri-council or community funding combined with autonomy, or are there other things that need to be in place from a public policy perspective? And the second question that I also wanted to bring your attention to is, do you know of any Indigenous technology or Indigenous future projects that are being undertaken in Latin America? I live and work in Mexico as an anthropologist and would love to see support these kinds of workshops here.
So I'll just answer this, unfortunately, because I don't know, right? But that's part of what I'm hoping happens as, you know, word spreads around the position paper, is to find out about projects down there. So, but the first question, I think, is a great question. So I'm going to pick on CIFAR a little bit, but that's because they know I like them. So they've involved me in some of the conversations that, you know, with the AI, you know, the system builders, which has been really interesting and lovely. And they, so I went to one of these. Oh my God, I'm going to forget. Yes, I went to one of these things, and there were like 5 of us guests. So people who were not AI fellows, you know, CIFAR fellows. And we, you know, spoke. And then CIFAR asked us to stay afterwards and talk to them about, like, okay, how do we, you know, within that context of the AI and Society conference, like, you know, how do we support work that gets at these questions? You know, and my response was, you know, you fund, I don't know how many they fund, 15, 20 AI fellows for $1 million a year for over 5 years. I said, give that money to me, right? I was like, or you don't have to give it to me. I got funding, right? But go and find the social science researchers, people working in Indigenous studies in different places that are actively engaged with cultural issues, and give the money to them, so that they can then go and find computer scientist collaborators in the way that the technical people like are forced to come talk to us because they need some culture, right? So that they have the money to go find the computer science people, the system builders, and bring them in and spend 5 well-funded years trying to like prototype these systems, maybe build some, sort of figure out what it is. So that's a huge thing. And that's not just CIFAR, obviously, right? That's the Tri-Council, that's private money, philanthropic money, right? All this money, these, billions of dollars that's going into AI research, and people are like, oh, well, okay, yeah, you social scientists or humanities people, you can have $10,000, right? Or if we're feeling generous, we'll give you 50,000, right? That's bullshit. Okay, and we all know it's bullshit. If you actually want to, if you are serious, if CIFAR, the Tri-Council, the federal government is serious about creating a diverse ecosystem around AI, then they got to fund these other attempts at the same level, right? So that's a really big one. I mean, at the end of the day, all the problems come down to, it's the three things, right? It's bodies, money, and time, right? And so part of that too is that we have to figure out ways to build capacity, to fund building capacity, right? So that we can find young Indigenous people, young in high school, right? We can give them a really solid undergraduate training, figure out how to get them into graduate school so that they have the capacity to do this work, right? So those are the two big things that I would say, are necessary. I mean, and I think the other thing is, I really believe, obviously, in this idea of imaginaries, right? Karine knows we talked about this in the earlier talk. That part of what's issue is you have to actually start making it seem possible, right? You have to start doing this work, publishing, workshops, stuff like that, so that people, I keep pointing over there because my wife, who's my collaborator on a lot of this stuff, is sitting on the other side of the big table here from me. When we started the AbTech work and when we tried to start it in 2014, we got a lot of people, both in our communities outside, that were like, oh, native people, if you're really native, you're not developing technology, right? You're like beating stuff or you're whatever it is, something like seriously. Like, it's hard to believe now, but that's what happened, and in the last 16 years, certainly part of our work, but there's a bunch of other people, Grace Dillon with Indigenous futurism work, there's really talented, amazing people out there who've been doing that. Like, they've been saying like, oh, well, no, actually, we've been innovators forever, right? We totally are capable of engaging with this technology, and it's totally indigenous, right? So, and that's also something that opens it up for our young people so that they can be like, oh, I can do that. Like, we know this classic thing of like, the first Indigenous astronaut. It's like, oh crap, you mean they let native people do that, right? And then 15 years later, it sounds like a joke because we can't believe that it was actually true, but it was, right?
Thank you so much, Professor Lewis. Today has been enlightening in more than one way. You brought about the importance of investing in mechanisms to ensure that Indigenous youth and Indigenous experts have the methodologies and the mechanisms in order to create these systems that are truly going to diversify these technologies and change it for the better and have a societal impact. Additionally, you brought forward the importance of combating stereotypical notions of Indigenous communities, both in the Hawaiian context and globally, and as well as not taking a pan-Indigenous approach in order to ensure that these technologies have the investment and therefore the impact necessary to serve the communities that are building them. So thank you so much. That's just a few of some of the important notes that you mentioned today. And again, we're very thankful that you were able to spend your time with us today. I just wanted to end off on 2 points regarding the initiative. We have 2 upcoming events, first being on December 2nd, titled AI at the Border with Petra Molnar in conversation with Jamie Liu, discussing the use of AI at the border and migration management, as well on December 7th, titled AI in Healthcare with Colleen Flood and Anna Goldenberg. We'll be discussing AI in healthcare and its impact on vulnerable populations. If you would like to know more about the events that we hold, as well as the initiative, you can please check out our website at techlaw.uottawa.ca/AI Society. Again, thank you, Professor Lewis. Today was extremely insightful and very thankful for the knowledge that you provided to us.